Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Day 3 of the 2022 Government Contract Pricing Summit. Please welcome to the stage Al Boykin and Charlie Williams.
Day 3.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Yeah.
One last good morning. Well, good morning. All right, sounds good.
Yeah. Day 3, and I tell you, so Charlie, previous years we've had 2 days of events, and I think it's befitting that we have 3 days because there's just so much to talk about. It's been 2 years, right, since we've seen everybody. What did you think about yesterday and that super panel that we had yesterday morning, huh?
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. You know, when you talk about 3 days out, I have been saving all those questions that we couldn't get to, and I'm going to give them to David Cade this morning. What do you think?
Excellent.
Or John Tenaglia, where is he? All right, so you guys get ready.
Yeah, and I saved some for John Tenaglia
You got
this
some?
afternoon. So
yeah.
y'all just want to be sure that, hey, this afternoon as we culminate this this event for this year, so John Tenaglia is really looking forward to coming up and having the conversation with us. We do have some tough questions for him that he is all set for. I just want to give a quick shout out though to Alliant. These folks, and they have done a superb job.
There's a guy back there named Michael. Michael's the lead production guy here.
Yeah.
It's awesome. Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, super job, guys. So, we've had some good weather here as well, huh? You guys have enjoyed yesterday was a beautiful day. Today should be pretty nice as well, and next Tuesday should be good too. So,
They didn't catch that, did they?
Maybe I'll see you. I look forward to coming back though, for sure. So what do we have on tap today, Charlie?
Wow, we have a very, talk about finishing strong. We've got this morning, I'm going to introduce to you in a little while Mr. David Cade, but later today we've got John Tenaglia, and we've got a phenomenal think tank coming up. Don't forget that one. It's really about, sort of this thing called excessive profit, really. And I encourage you to get to that think tank. It should be a rich, powerful conversation around these ideas about profit and how much profit is too much profit. So engage in that conversation at the think tank. So it's
too much profit.
Too much. Is there such a thing?
Hey,
let's go talk to Apple. What do you think?
Yeah, let's go talk to Apple. Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah. So just a couple of quick announcements before we bring up the first speaker. So go ahead and start thinking about your questions for Mr. Cade this morning. He's excited to come out and have a conversation with you. But we, in addition to the tough questions that Charlie already has, go ahead and start putting those into the Q&A box so that we can pass those over to David as well. Then, got the think tank coming up. But also, I think you want to make sure that there's a survey at the end of each one of the sessions. So you want to make sure that you go to those surveys and fill out that survey so that we can make sure that we get prepared for 2023. And oh, by the way, plans are already in the making for 2023. There were some folks that approached me over the last couple of days that really had some pretty good ideas. And Charlie, I just got one last thing. So I was talking with a couple of folks over on day 1, I think it was, and I had asked the question about how many folks had actually been with us the entire 7 years. And there are some folks out there that's been with us for 7 years. Awesome. And we can't see you because, as Mike said, there's the silhouette in the witness protection program that you guys are protected by. So can't see you, but you know who you are. And I think what we might want to do is just have like a badge of honor, for those folks when they come back for their 8th
In the 8th year?
Yeah, man.
I like that.
Yeah. I think that would be good. And
maybe we can talk to the pro pricer about giving them a good discount too.
A good discount is always good. 8%. 8% would be great. And, we would be remiss if we did not say something about General Holt and his presentation. What do you, yeah, how about that?
You know, I told you guys he was one of my favorite generals. That's just because we spent a lot of time together, but really powerful message. He thinks a lot. He's a very deep thinker, and he thinks a lot about why we do what we do, right, from a operational, contextual perspective. So I'm hoping you enjoyed it the way I enjoyed it. I've heard him talk about that stuff a lot, and it just resonates.
Yeah, and he's going to be with us, even though he's retiring. He wants to stay with this summit. He wants to stay with the pricing folks, and because it's always a great and robust conversation that you all have, and he likes being a part of that. So even though he's taken off the uniform, he has a desire to stay in the conversation. So,
You want to get started?
without further ado, Charlie, I'm going to turn it over to you, and we'll see you guys later on.
Thank you, Al. Hey, so guys, talking about finishing strong. This morning we have for you Mr. David Cade. And David Cade is a stellar performer and awesome executive in Boeing. He currently serves as the Vice President for Government Services and Transformation in the Boeing Company, where he is leading the creation of new business solutions around Boeing's digitally enabled capabilities. Now, prior to that, David served as the Vice President of Contracts, Corporate Contracts at Boeing, and previously to that, he was the Vice President of Finance in Boeing Global Services. So he's got a rich amount of experience in Boeing and in corporate America, but he also has a law degree from University of, let me make sure I get that right, University of Michigan. I didn't want to say Michigan State. University of Michigan, and he served in law firms and was an attorney for the General Motors. So quite a bit of experience in the corporate America. He brings with him great connection to the Department of Defense and the work that he's done in that world. And we're looking forward to his comments this morning to help us think about how corporate America and industry really thinks about this challenge that we have around pricing, contracting, and acquisition. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Mr. David Cade.
Thank you, Charlie and Al, for that introduction and for inviting me here to speak this morning. Good morning. I am honored to be here and actually surprised I'm able to do so. Now, these opinions today are mine and mine alone and not attributable to Boeing. And no, General Holt and I did not coordinate our remarks. So when Charlie called and invited me to speak at this conference last October, the world looked different, both for us as a nation, as an industry, and for me personally. At the time, as a nation, we were still focused on how to emerge from the COVID pandemic. Granted, we were experiencing some inflationary wage pressures and trying to entice a return to work, being led by mask mandates and mandatory vaccinations. But while the economy was relatively strong and many of us had figured out how to remote work when possible and socially distance when necessary, there were expectations that things would pick up at some point as people got back into their places of work versus telecommuting. As an industry, we had continued operations for the most part, although there were times when disruptions in our supply chain and illness or quarantines among our workforce caused schedule interruptions. The Department of Defense worked quickly and generously with industry to revise progress payments to enable us to pay our suppliers faster and keep our workforces engaged. Personally, in my prior corporate contracts role, I was adjusting to a new boss, our recently hired CFO, and really hitting my stride health-wise by getting it down to my ideal weight. A lot of things changed at the end of January into February of this year, however. First, the Supreme Court struck down the administration's OSHA vaccination policy. Within less than 2 weeks, many in our industry also dropped the policy of requiring that vaccinations occur by a set deadline and relaxed or eliminated masking requirements entirely. Second, it became clear that inflation, and just as important, supply chain disruptions, were no longer transitory. As a result, there was greater concern raised about a potential recession, and worse in our industry, fears about contract impacts, specifically for those that were fixed price with no equitable adjustment clauses built in. Sounds familiar. Around this time, Russia invaded Ukraine. And for me, I had a few weeks of weird and seemingly unrelated symptoms that I initially attributed to either the flu or perhaps COVID. But my symptoms stabilized enough that I planned to go to DC for the annual Black Engineer of the Year Awards. Unfortunately, on February 18th, instead of being in DC celebrating Bay with colleagues and friends, I found myself in a hospital emergency room. And those weird symptoms turned out to be the onset of a rare and usually fatal diagnosis, specifically bile duct cancer, which eventually led to a medical leave of absence and major abdominal surgery to remove, some organs in the offending cancer. Now, before I went out on leave, I called Charlie and told him what was happening. Charlie did not ask whether or not I was still planning on speaking. Instead, he asked how I was doing and what he could do for me. He even checked in on me a few times via text to make sure all was well, especially after my surgery. I became very motivated to speak here because I did not want to disappoint Charlie. Besides, he had already advertised me on the speaker conference materials. While I was on medical leave, I really scratched my head about what topic to discuss this morning. Charlie had given general guidance and suggested policy matters of interest from an industry perspective. This meant I could discuss inflation and perhaps raise industry concerns about the impacts of the bottom line and the need for additional funding sooner. Or I could discuss the DPC financing study. Commercial pricing is always an interesting topic. Or better yet, raising our supply chains and how industry would make them more resilient could have been a real barn burner. When your world suddenly changes on a dime and you get a lot of free time to ponder what life looks like for you in the future, or if you should plan for a future, a lot runs through your mind. And to be honest with you, as I really wondered what to discuss between doctor visits and trying to rest, all I could think about was one thing: trust. Yes, trust. Okay, so now you're wondering, how does trust relate to why we are here at this conference? Well, I hope I'm not telling a family secret. Doing business with the US government is, to be kind, a Byzantine process. Years pass between an initial RFP, protracted negotiations, multiple clearance reviews, an actual contract, and a final product. Some of us are fortunate enough if we get to see the entire life cycle from start to finish before we move into a new role. Now, don't worry, government customers. Industry does not get a pass here either. We fail to answer your basic questions with basic information, instead hiding behind truckloads of data when a two-page email will suffice. Also, you need one of those idiot's guides to understand our cost structure, especially when we have multiple business units and perform IWAS. Or better yet, we wrap everything in the flag of commerciality and tell you to go away since you can't inquire about those costs. So neither side is very good at efficiency or speed or getting goods or services into the hands of the ultimate customer, the warfighter. Why is that? Trust. We spend more time verifying the data we get from each other or recasting it in myriad and different formats for all of our internal reviews than we do performing the work or getting product to the warfighter, because we either don't trust what is in front of us, we don't trust our own processes to generate an answer we can live with, or even worse, we just don't trust each other. At the end of the day, it is a self-perpetuating problem, and it's going to take some real leadership to solve it. So what does the solution look like? Frankly, I don't know. I'm not going to pretend I have the answers, but we can discuss what a framework for greater trust would look like. But let me go in reverse order. Part of my motivation is a general frustration from the last 14 years being in this industry. As Charlie indicated previously, I was at General Motors. We spend an inordinate amount of time and effort going back and forth admiring the problem, but never seem to settle on a practical long-term solution that lasts beyond the tenure of a particular leader at a certain company or government customer. The other part of my motivation is more selfish and related to the new role I took on a few weeks ago, which in part is to identify a better way for Boeing to do business with all of you, both customers and industry. So I'm really looking for ways to eliminate bureaucracy and bottlenecks that impact speed to contract, as well as breaking the mold on how we contract with a focus on the art of the possible, and maybe trying to lower the stress levels a little and direct that energy more on what is important, the warfighter. Now, I like to analogize a lot. I find the world is a big circle, and you can often find answers to problems by looking to see how others solve what may be similar but expressly unrelated issues. On April 26th of this year, the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee held a hearing on the health of the defense industrial base. Ellen Lord, former Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, and David Berteau, President and CEO of the Professional Services Council, testified. Like I said, I was out on leave and I had a lot of free time to think. But I believe this particular hearing gets to the heart of the problem we as an industry face. Frankly, I think each of us should either go back and watch the hearing or better yet, read the transcript. From their testimony and the questions asked by the senators, it is clear they recognize trust is a problem, even if they didn't come out and say it explicitly. Let me extrapolate. Senator and Chairman Jack Reed opened the hearing and initiated his comments by stating, quote, more broadly, the procurement and acquisition practice of the Department of Defense and the federal government are often convoluted, poorly communicated, and burdened with inertia that makes contracting with private industry far too difficult, end quote. Now relax. Ms. Lord and Mr. Berteau pushed back somewhat against this notion and pointed to necessary congressional action that could alleviate some of the contracting burdens in our industry that our government customers grapple with in order to move faster. Going back and forth in their testimony, there are 3 points that they raised that I think get to the concept of trust. First, the mission is paramount. Berteau hammered this point right at the outset. How many times have we pointed the finger at each other during negotiations and jabbed, you're so focused on profit and not on the needs of the warfighter? Or, you don't appreciate I have shareholders to satisfy. Okay, let's get past this easy one first. Industry has the same mission focus on the warfighter as does our government customer. And our government customer wants a healthy and profitable defense industrial base to stay on that mission. Our collective mission, whether you're inside the DoD or in corporate America, is to provide quality products and services to the warfighter as soon as possible at a reasonable price. Now, without naming names, it is not helpful when we hear about certain contractors who purportedly exploit sole source positions to allegedly gouge the government with obscene profit rates. Nor is it helpful when contracting officers offer decrements to industry proposals that don't make economic sense and force us to accept lowball offers when we need to keep production line going or the proposal clock is running out. But let's agree those are general exceptions, not the rule. Bottom line, we are all patriots and focused on the mission, period. That in turn means we need to learn to trust each other better and not question motivations. Industry wants to make a reasonable profit and help the warfighter. Our government customers want to get goods and services to the warfighter in a timely manner and protect the taxpayers' funds. So rather than wasting time questioning motives, let's spend more time in trust but verify mode. Right before my surgery and later while I was out on leave, I had come to trust my various doctors and the advice they gave me about treatment options. Well, they really weren't options. It was more of an acceptance they had a mission, namely me. I'd have a specific surgery called a Whipple, where they remove your gallbladder, about half your pancreas, some of your small intestine, and part of your bile duct, and they sew everything back together. So the mission was how to treat my condition, and I had to be part of it if we wanted success. I spent an inordinate amount of time reading medical journals and scouring reliable websites to better understand potential outcomes from the sage advice that doctors were giving. The typical trust but verify mindset. Now, my wife fussed at me because I would communicate with them almost daily over a secure patient portal they employed. But it was great to look at blood test results or doctor notes and make sure I fully understood what they proposed as a course of treatment. I would point out to the doctors or their nursing staff various studies I'd read which had different results, or would drill down to understand and converse with them in very specific, detailed medical terminology. Even in our office visits, I would often ask questions about my own anatomy or their written reports that were housed on the portal. But let me be clear. I was not challenging their advice or questioning their motives. I was trying to be a better consumer of their services. I was level setting my own expectations about what outcomes to expect since I'd come to trust them and their advice. They knew what they were doing, and they did not see my independent research as a challenge to their authority. In fact, they told my wife right before the surgery that they rather enjoyed my questions, since most of the time patients just went along and operated out of fear instead of empowerment. So what happens if we get better at this trust thing amongst ourselves and operate in a trust but verify mode, where we ask a lot of questions about the data and try to make sure we understand and are truly informed? What does that look like for us in our professional relationships and the specific outcomes we desire for the mission? Second, CYA and process. Both Ms. Lord and Mr. Bartow each highlighted repeatedly the general risk-averse culture within the government contracting ranks. But then they pointed out the obvious response many of you may be thinking. Risk-taking and problem-solving generally is not rewarded. As part of this line of questioning, Senator Cade challenged the ability of the government to move fast. Ms. Lord pointed out that Congress does not hold hearings to celebrate creativity and speed to contract. She went so far as to suggest rethinking how contracting officers are promoted with an emphasis on those who can do just enough to be compliant. She called the concept creative compliance, and she suggested moving out using other means besides FAR 15, such as using OTAs. Mr. Berteau suggested we should not punish risk takers for gambling a little bit. With respect to the risk-averse culture, unfortunately, the contracting view of industry overcharging the government, and in turn, the extensive auditing of our contracts and financials, has existed for too long. Some of it is deserved. Senator Manchin raised the overpriced toilets and hammers in contracts of years past. But again, that is not the general rule. While there are some real-world examples we can point to today, the vast majority of contractors are not overcharging the government or shifting unreasonable overhead into the cost of the goods purchased. On the other hand, it is too easy just to rely upon FAR 15, focus on extensive cost analysis, even for commercial of a type buys without conducting market analysis, and load up the contract with all the FAR 15 requirements versus looking at what the FAR provisions are really needed for this particular contract or for what is being purchased, or using market and price analysis for commercial and of a type, or even employing OTAs or simplified contracts when there are repeated purchases of the same goods or services, unique requirements or timelines involved. DPC Director John Tenaglia acknowledged this concern last year in an interview when he stated, quote, "I hear frequently that DoD is overly focused on cost-based analysis and that we're not ready to fully embrace price analysis associated with commercial products and services," end quote. Moreover, we all live in a world where our every move on both sides of contractual transaction is scrutinized, often after the fact, and with a Monday morning quarterback perspective in isolation and without context, years after decisions were made. No one likes that kind of limelight. For example, a 2021 DoD IG audit of the Defense Logistics Agency explored cost-saving assumptions in certain strategic support contracts using performance-based outcomes. Among other things, the IG audit challenged certain cost recovery rate assumptions in the DLA business case for entering into those contracts. Let me note, the audit did not say anything was improper. It just questioned the math behind the assumptions and requested the DLA show its proverbial homework after the fact. Now, the contracts audited are part of a series of contracts the DLA implemented to increase material availability using incentives with industry where the government recognized it could not do so effectively. For the most part, the audit indicated the contracts in fact did increase material availability. However, the IG audit, while it did not directly criticize the DLA for engaging in a creative way to solve a real-world problem for the warfighter, if you read between the lines, it did. In other words, why should a contracting officer stick her neck out to find a way to get on contract faster with a clear and measurable outcome and real cost savings that were part of a robust and reviewed business case when years later, someone with the benefit of hindsight says you did not get it exactly right? If anything, this leads to over-reliance on precedents and deliberately slow consideration in contracting. Now, I'm not criticizing the usefulness and necessity of audits. The cost climate does not lend itself to being imprecise with the details or unclear with contracting language. And again, we all must be good stewards of taxpayer funds. However, we need to be proactive. Where do we lay out on both sides what we want to accomplish with any particular acquisition and involve the audit agencies at the onset to at least give a gut check early on about issues they see with any proposed approach? It is not asking them to weigh in and say yes or no. It is just asking them if their experience shows the contracting parties are missing something. Now, unfortunately, this requires additional resources. But again, this is all about trust. If we trust people to be more creative, perhaps make some small mistakes, share lessons learned, and repeat, does this drive the feedback loop necessary? Instead of saying what happened, perhaps we can learn to say instead, what did we learn? Maybe there's a question about the business case used to enter into the contract, and someone needs to modify the business case for the next time. but is the proposition the business case advocated for was actually flawed? Or is it just needs to be adjusted to document more realistic expectations learned in hindsight? So where's the disconnect? It is deep down among those doing the work who see the attention they get for thinking outside the box is not the attention they desire or want to explain. So it is just easier to say, just do everything to be compliant. But there's a cost to this sort of blind compliance. There are studies raising the price penalty for government contracting and reliance on overly burdensome regulations. Third and finally, I believe the biggest challenge we collectively as an industry face is asking, what problem are we trying to solve? What is in front of us? None of us seem to agree, however. Should the focus be on outcomes, such as clearly defined metrics and an intellectual curiosity to see if some tweaks of requirements in a contract structure benefits both sides at the end of an acquisition? Do we look at the relationship between certain outcomes and make some real cost-benefit analysis determinations, such as material availability at X%, recognizing it might have a Y% increase on cost structure, such as additional depots or manpower? Do we each lay bare 5 to 10 things we want to get out of an acquisition and perform an after-action review to see which expectations were met and how they were achieved so we can collectively praise the team and incentivize them for the next iteration to improve upon? Better yet, do we focus on increasing transparency over how we model a proposal and a response to see if there is a help needed to improve the process or change a model? Or is the answer yes, we want that too, but cost and schedule rule first and foremost. So let's argue about the proposal provided, show me your detailed cost structure, and then demonstrate you pay the lowest possible price with your suppliers before we discuss adding outcomes or set any clear expectations using metrics. And then if we don't get the data, let's elevate to senior leadership and start the argument all over again. The latter is what we've done for far too long. Mr. Berteau highlighted to Senator Kane an earlier discussion he had with an unknown contracting officer. Berteau suggested using a different part of the FAR for greater flexibility instead of FAR 15. The CO replied, quote, "I am more comfortable with the one that tells me everything I need to do and I do not have to make any decisions on my own," end quote. Clearly, someone did not trust themselves to move faster. But how do you encourage speed to contract, or flexibility, or creativity in a procurement, which is not a new competitive proposal, but let's say merely a sustainment acquisition, follow-on for parts or services that have been bought for years, where there's tons of data and the bulk of the cost is located? How do you look at outcomes instead of just cost inputs and recognize how to address the hard work down the road when sustainment is required? I don't mean to poke at either side, but I'm certain you all share my frustration with the unnecessary emotional energy involved in a large number of acquisitions among us. So is the real solution a wholesale rewrite of the FAR, especially FAR 15? Perhaps. But sometimes trying to write policy and guidance before we get a win, or try the art of the possible and a focus on a particular outcome, leads to unintended consequences. Now, Ms. Lord suggested a focus on the authorities we already have, such as using OTAs, or maybe we set clear and documented expectations and outcomes on both sides. What if we understand what is really required by FAR 15 and what is a check-the-box exercise? We need to have senior leadership involved for monthly or quarterly reviews, and only have on our teams people with a clear let's find a way mindset versus relying on precedents or strong reputations as naysayers. Empower the teams to make decisions. Don't punish them if they make a mistake. Celebrate the learning. Encourage creativity and problem solving with the just enough compliance mentality. Champion those teammates to our leaders. Promote them and indicate to others why they're being promoted. Demonstrate a trust but verify mindset. And if someone objectively is not behaving in the right way, move them off the teams. And then when the acquisition is over, we have to hold and document an after-action review. Seriously ask, what did we learn versus focusing on the mindset of I didn't get everything I wanted from this deal. Ask what can be done differently next time, and how we can measure it objectively and agree that is the right measure. And then repeat the process and throw the same teams back at it. Share the lessons learned more broadly. Encourage additional training, but not solely with either an industry or customer mindset. Have those from the other side of the transaction share their perspectives also. There's real value there. If we are truly focused on meeting the mission, this is not a tall ask. Senior leadership on both sides demand this behavior, and they need to insist congressional leaders use the same metrics and celebrate wins, not just mistakes. We can show everyone we are making contracting an iterative process instead of a series of one-offs with slow time to contract. And as General Holt said yesterday, and Mr. Berteau and several senators in April, we can counter the threat from China by moving fast. But to do any of this, we need to learn to trust. Again, thank you for the opportunity to address you today, and now I think Charlie is going to field some questions from the audience. Thank you.
All right, do I have some questions for you? So thank you, David. Really appreciate those comments. I'm going to start with this trust idea again, right? Because we've heard it throughout the week, and you've properly observed the challenge, right? So this question sort of relates to, as you look at the situation and the relationship between government and industry today, and you look back 10 years, are we worse today than we were 10 years ago? Is it just an evolution of trust, or have we really gone off the rails here?
I think it's gotten a little worse in the sense that there's probably more scrutiny with technology. So you have things like Twitter, you have the media, social media. It's a lot easier for someone to air a grievance. And a lot of times when you have, for instance, hearings, you might see politicians looking to score points or have a particular comment or soundbite. This hearing didn't. It was actually very interesting to see all of the senators, both Republican and Democrat, were focused on the same issue, which was how do we move faster? How do we counter the threat to China? How do we protect the industrial base? But I think a lot of that speed of getting out in media and the negative reflections that are there makes it much easier to highlight mistakes. And I think that causes people to be more apprehensive. And since they're more apprehensive, that in turn has people not wanting to trust as much, because the worry is my name will be in lights, my career will be ruined if I make a mistake. And instead, I think General Holt said it yesterday, we need to celebrate we made a mistake because we learned something. Right. Now, if it's fraud, if someone did it improper, that's there. But as a great example, you know, back with Boeing, I won't get into the details, but General Holt and I were going over last year some numbers for KC-46, and they were looking at certain parts. We screwed up on one of the parts listed, and it was highlighted, you know, before we got to General Holt to explain to him, and he was like, "Oh my God, the price was 1,000% higher, 1,100%." Someone fat-fingered a number. They keyed in the wrong number on a part, and we honored that and said, "We screwed up. We're going to honor our commitment, even though we're going to take a loss on this one." And I think we've got to get better at asking, "Okay, I see something. It doesn't make sense with the data. Explain to me what's going on," and assume good intent, and then go from there.
Yeah. You know, I'll say this. I work with a lot of different clients, and one of the things that I observe a lot of times when I go with a client is the relationship between the client and government. And I had a client once who I'd go in and I'd say, you know, and they had a problem, right? They were trying to address a problem with one of the agencies. And my first question was, when was the last time you talked to the CACO or the DACO, right? And I got this very long, drawn-out answer, which really said they really didn't have a relationship. And so this issue of trust, I think, has a lot to do with building relationships between government and industry that everyone needs to embrace. How do you, inside of Boeing, try to make that relationship work or address those relationship issues just to start building that kind of conversation? So you have the path to
Right.
deal with the trust issue.
So I think the first thing that we learned to do, and Daryl Scott had the job before me, and one of the things he said, well, he would get frustrated with, and he told me, don't just go to them when you have a problem.
Right.
And I think typically what ends up happening is there's an issue, and industry shows up at the last minute, bangs on the door, gets really upset, and expects or demands that government make some moves. And industry could be right. But part of it is just having a relationship and having a conversation on a regular cadence. And it doesn't have to be any particular problems, just like, hey, how was your weekend? General Holt and I would talk about his son playing football. I talked about my daughters and the sports they were in. And sometimes we didn't have anything specific to talk about. So you build that relationship early on so that when you call in for a favor, that it's not last minute, I don't know who you are, and you've learned to humanize each other. And I think we've got to get better at that. We all make mistakes. We all sometimes get out of our lane. We sometimes have to get certain goals accomplished. And I think if people learn that you're just like them, it makes it a lot easier to trust, and it makes it a lot easier to say, okay, what is it that I can do to help you? Because I'll expect a favor in return at some point and need something.
So let's get a little tactical, right?
Okay.
So if you were USDA&S,
Okay.
what would be your highest priority policy initiative? What is it that just needs to get done to make this system and the acquisition system work better for our customers?
Speed. And I think General Holt said it. It takes too long, and we're guilty on both sides. We hide behind, oh, it's so difficult. There's a long process. We can't approve things quickly, and I think that's garbage. I mean, I would encourage moving faster and finding errors, just so you can say, okay, how do we learn from them? How do we improve upon the system? I don't think people are apprehensive, and it tends to be they don't want to make a decision as they see career limiting, so they wait for their boss to make a decision, and then their boss makes a decision, and it's up the chain, versus finding someone on the team who is just passionate about the mission and recognizing that, embracing them, and encouraging them. But again, people are going to make errors, and we've got to take the fear of punishment away, and we've got to instead say, okay, why did you do this? What was the thought process? And there might be something that was very legitimate that in the circumstances at the time made perfect sense. I had years ago back, I was actually Vice President of Contracts for Boeing Defense, and we had an interim CFO. We had 20 minutes. There was, the government had reshaped a requirement. It was worth over $1 billion, and we had 20 minutes to accept it. Now, it wasn't inside my authority, and we couldn't find the interim CFO. Everyone was panicking. It was 4:40 on a Friday, and I just sent an email out, for the record, it's my call, don't do it. And then I sent a note to the CFO and says, if I violated anything, consider this my letter of resignation. She called me 2 hours.
You're still here.
I'm still here. And she called me 2 hours later. She goes, well, that was stupid. But, there were so many people that were afraid, like, oh, my God, we can't get into her decision. And I'm like, we got 20 minutes for $1 billion. And it wasn't like some wild decision. It was just like accepting the government response, and we had talked about it. So, again, I think a lot of times we operate so much out of fear and recriminations versus how do we get the right answer.
Yeah. So over the last few days, we've had a lot of conversation about the workforce, how we grow and develop pricers and contracts folks. So this question says, I'm new to the pricing world and this GCP summit, as a matter of fact. So welcome. Thank you for your transparency and sincerity of thought. What top 3 things would you recommend to new acquisition pricing professionals to assist them on their career growth path in industry or government?
So first, General Holt was talking yesterday about training acquisition personnel to go through commercial government, 10Ks, quarterly filings, et cetera. I would go a little bit further. What motivates people. And a lot of times in industry, for instance, it's compensation. And I would figure out how do they get compensated at the top. Not just how the company makes money or what their goals are, but what is the leadership and how are they being compensated? Because that'll tell you a lot of times what's driven down. Learn to read the financials. That's paramount. Understand what the product is. Second, really build a network. The world's a circle, and you never know who you're going to run into again at any point in time. And so you don't have to be difficult, but you don't have to be a pushover. Knowing people, being pleasant, you have a job to do, you have expectations, so make sure that you meet those, and no one can accuse you of not having integrity. But at the same time, I've run across people who are just difficult people, and no matter what's going on, that's their reputation. And so people remember them, and that's not going to go far when it's their turn and the circle comes around. And third, never stop learning. I think it's very, General Holt talked about not getting training. There's self-training. There's a lot of things that people should be doing that's of interest. Volunteer, even if you see a hot new area or product line coming out, the industry's talking about, volunteer to go and be the one, especially if it's new. There might be people who are in their career and they're kind of afraid of failure, and they're like, well, I don't know, and you go in there and learn it quickly and become the expert, you might see your career really take off.
So I'm going to ask you a question that came up yesterday. We had an industry member here yesterday from Raytheon on a panel, and he was asked the question, why is it so hard when the government asks industry for cost and pricing data? It seems like industry always pushes back a lot. Now, we had the flip of that question was, why is the government always asking for so much data? Right? So do you see a happy medium here in terms of appropriate amounts of cost data and industry's desire and willingness to deliver what's necessary?
So, part of the problem is the government sometimes wants data in a format we don't collect it. And so when they're asking for data in that format, there's a concern, am I generating false information that I can be charged with? Again, there's a fear there. If we produce data and it doesn't look in the format the government wants it, then there's a problem. They want us to either reformat it or they're going to do it themselves. And again, a lot of, there are 6 legacy companies, or there are 6 companies now, and then a lot of the legacy government contractors have been bought up. And so we have different cost structures depending on which business unit you're in and accounting roles. I think there has to be a greater appreciation for that. And rather than get upset with the data that you're given, I would sit there and say, walk me through the data and show me how this flows, how you would explain it to your CFO if they were asking questions. And then you can question the information that's there. That's a better approach. But I think the flip side for us in terms of the data, things like commercial data that the government asks for, it's not so much that we're worried about the commerciality of it. It's sometimes trade secrets. I mean, there are things at Boeing from Boeing Commercial that I'm not worried if the government saw it. I'm worried about where it gets housed when the government gets their hands on it and it somehow gets released inadvertently and Airbus sees it and gets in the public domain. That's more important.
So is that a trust issue? Is it a trust issue that Boeing or industry just doesn't trust the government to do?
Well, we've had instances where data's been released, and so it's warranted, just as if, we've had instances where, people have overcharged or made mistakes. And now we found ways around some of that, but part of it is just having a come to Jesus moment up front and just say, here's my concern. And rather than being dismissive, and rather than say, oh, that would never happen, acknowledge, and like I said, General Holt and I, until they had someone in place for the Boeing defense role, I was doing a couple different roles, and he agreed. He said, yeah, we've screwed things up. And so let's talk about that, and rather than just getting angry and saying, you won't provide me the data, maybe I have it housed on a computer somewhere on my facility, and you have access to it, so you can go. Maybe we control where it goes afterwards, so we ensure that it doesn't get inadvertently released. Obviously, you want to make sure the auditors can see it, but then you want to make sure maybe another program doesn't need access to it, because do they have to turn it over to another competitor if is that information that gets out there? So talk about expectations and what your fears are versus just throwing accusations at each other. And that really helps get past the trust and allow people to say, okay, I see your point. That makes some sense. Let's figure a way to address that concern rather than being dismissive of it.
So when I was the director of Defense Contract Management Agency, one of the things that we were trying to do, and the reason that agency sort of exists was to try and create consistency across industry, business segments of industry, and across the Department of Defense, because our view has always been it's inefficient to drive companies to operate differently across different business units. Are you concerned about any of that today relative to how the Department of Defense manages contracts either across the different services? Do you see consistency or
Inconsistency.
inconsistency?
I think it depends on, it gets down into the working level. For instance, just being practical, it doesn't make a lot of sense if you have a common bolt and it was bought under one contract and it had all the FAR 15 clauses. And then another follow-on contract buys that same bolt and maybe it doesn't have everything. And then a third contract is out there and it's got a mix between the two, or it was bought commercial. It's the same part. It's got the same part number. It's got the same fit, form, and function. Yet someone will come in and say, identify which one of these bolts that don't have labels on it is mine. And I get it. Sometimes it's easy. A contracting officer will throw everything on there and it's being managed that way. But sometimes people have got to take a step back and say, is this the most efficient way? Is this practical? What makes sense? And we don't see that. And when you raise the concerns, you get pushback sometimes about, well, we're going to enforce the terms of the contract. Okay, I got it. But you have to just be practical because you're driving costs into the system. So saying, okay, I want you to segregate those bolts, individually package them, put them in different locations, build a warehouse. You're just building a cost structure you're paying for as the government. And when we hear we want to move like commercial, we want to move fast. I had a meeting in the Pentagon years ago with Sheh Assad, and he said, how come I'm not treated like a commercial customer? How come I can't buy a part for a P-8 like a 737 customer does? And I said, it's easy. You've got all the cost in there. You've got to have the systems in place. You've got everything that's going on. You're driving all of this. We'll let you onto our parts page and order like a commercial customer, but you got to buy like a commercial customer. You can't start adding in all this other stuff that you want, and you've got to trust the process and the market forces that are there. You can get your part in 2 days rather than 2 years.
So this gets back to this. So you're getting me into this conversation about the government. When we talk about the government buying commercial, I call it this insatiable appetite for cost data, right? And I worry that we still have a hard time thinking about value versus cost data, right? Mm-hmm. So as you were saying that, it made me think that, I still believe that somehow we've missed understanding how to bring value into our price reasonableness determination versus just simply cost data. Do you see any efforts being made, or do you see any successes in that area where, because you guys have sold the P-8 as a commercial, off of commercial aircraft, and you're doing the KC-4. Do you see anything going on that demonstrates that there's some progression on the government's part to accept that sort of basic commercial practice?
There's some, but again, it's in pockets. And what tends to happen is if there's commercial data that's not available. So for instance, if a part, let's say on the KC-46, it's a commercial part, and we're doing sustainment or proposal for sustainment, and the part hasn't been bought, and there's no sales history, instinctively the contracting officer says, well, I want all your cost information. Okay, well, the supplier's commercial, they don't have an approved system, they're not going to provide it anyway, and you're going to get frustrated. The better question would be to say, why is there no sales history? Maybe the commercial airlines aren't buying that part. Why aren't they buying the part? Well, maybe it's a repairable versus a consumable. Maybe it's something, instead of stocking 10 of them on the shelf, they just say, I have one as a spare that I move around, and I've got a repair depot that will fix it, and I swap it out. And having that conversation, understanding how commercial airlines buy parts. Again, I don't think there's a fear factor among contracting officers, and I understand it. I can't go wrong or be criticized if I've got binders of data. I may not understand it all, I may not look at it all, but I've got it. And so if I'm ever questioned by auditors, I can say, look at what I've done. I've collected all this information. Versus, great example, an iPad. An iPad is not $600 worth of materials. It's $60 worth of parts made by, a kid in China.
You're not making me feel good here. I just bought a new iPad.
My wife bought me one for the first time, and I fussed at her, and I was like, why'd you spend all that money on something? Because I'd been using the hand-me-downs. It's just not. Yet, we would have no problem as a contracting officer going out and buying an iPad and having no problem justifying if someone said, hey, I have a requirement for this. They don't get into the cost structure. So let's have some of that mindset that market forces prevail and allow basic economics to come into the picture where you can look and say, okay, is there a market for it? What's the market analysis? How many times has a contracting officer sat down with a contractor who's claiming something's commercial, and rather than saying, show me your cost, turn around and say, show me your price analysis, show me your market analysis. So if you're saying this is commercial, how did you internally decide to price this? It's not a cost buildup. We'll look at what the price the market will bear.
But let me challenge you. So admittedly, an iPad is much different than a P8 or
Correct.
KC46. So help us understand why, as I'm thinking about a KC46 that only has one customer, I should think about that the way I think about buying an iPad.
So KC46 only has one customer in the government, but on the commercial side, you've got DHL, you've got UPS, you've got other freight. It's a freighter. It's a 767 freighter. Now, there are components that are upgraded that are only government ones, and you might look at those not necessarily in the commercial format or understand the iteration going from what is the commercial part and how maybe it's beefed up, like the struts, how they're beefed up to go to government, so you could say of a type. But the vast majority of the airplane, there's commercial sales history that you can show. Here's what a customer paid for it. Here's what they may have paid for modifications to the aircraft. And you can understand the flow of how we approach the price analysis that we came to that we're going to sell it versus a commercial airline doing a cost buildup, which they don't do.
Right. So I got a question here. What are the U.S. government agencies doing to reduce the turn time for UCA's, undefinitized contract actions? We've had some going on 5+ years. In prime state, they cannot definitize with major subs because they're not definitized with the United States government. So what are you seeing in this area of definitizing contracts with the United States government?
Well, it's been a while since I've dealt with UCAs because of the corporate contracts role, but going back a few years and from what I hear from my colleagues, I think the real problem is it's easy to kick the can down the road. Sometimes the government either doesn't fully understand what it's buying, doesn't fully understand the contracting mechanism that's there, or they moved out so quickly that the final product hasn't shaped up. And you're just leaving people hanging. I mean, I remember years ago when Tom Robinson was head of contracting over at the Air Force, and we had a couple billion in UCAs. And I just said, Tom, we're going to get this resolved by the end of the year. We're just going to, and we made it a point every 2 weeks, get on the phone, hammered them out. And it's a slog. 5 years is just unacceptable. And frankly, I'm surprised someone hasn't been fired on either side to allow that to continue, because it just treats, it's a bad practice, and it ensconces it that everyone says, well, it's okay over here, so I'll do it, versus someone saying a UCA shouldn't be over 18 months, and there needs to be a good reason when it's there, and it needs to be approved by a supervisor or something else. But you've got to put a focus on it, and unfortunately that's going to require leadership from the top down, demanding data and asking, why does this still exist?
So the first question was sort of, one of the first questions was sort of about, if you were USDA and asked, what would you do as a high priority initiative? Let me turn that around. So if you were looking inside of Boeing and saying, this is the one thing that we can do much better and we just haven't gotten there yet, what would be that thing that you'd say, from an industry perspective, we can do better at this?
Working our supply base. It's still very slow, very methodical. We are not good at fully understanding what's out there in the supplier realm, and having an idea of what they can do and what they can do quickly. We get changes to a contract or for an RFP or something changes and we go back to get a complete quote. We haven't built a system where you can look at the different inputs and say, I've only changed 2 inputs, so do I have to go back and reprice everything, or can I focus on those 2 particular input changes and do it with the supply base? We're struggling, and unfortunately, COVID hasn't helped.
Okay, so Dave, we've come to about the end of our time. I want to give you the last chance to say a few words here, and I'd ask you to think about, again, back to the trust factor, but also the threat that we as a country faces and industry's role in helping the Department of Defense particularly deal with and be prepared for that threat. So,
well, you know, we all know the threat is real from China. We all know what's out there, and we spend too much time focused on each other, and I don't want to say cheap shots, but wins and versus what do we really need to get accomplished, which is move fast, get on contract, get parts going, get to the warfighter, fail early, be willing to admit that we made a mistake, course correct, and go from there. We as an industry really need to remember that we're all on the same team, United States. And if we do that, and we do that appropriately, we'll find that trust will come, it'll help us flow, it'll help us work out information that we need. And you know, if a contracting officer wants information, be plain about what you want and what you need it for. And don't hide behind, well, I deserve the data. Well, tell me what it is you're looking for, and I can give you an answer. And I can see, you know, as General Holt, we used to talk about, give me a 2-page email versus a truck of data. At the same time, we as industry need to stop hiding behind commercial and other things that we presume give us a competitive edge, and really instead focus on, we've got to get the mission completed, and what is that going to take, and make sure that those are the people that we have on the team that are focused on that role.
David, we thank you for coming out to the Government Contract Pricing Summit. We pray for your full recovery from your health illnesses, and look forward to seeing you again.
Definite.
Ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking Mr. David Cade. All right, so you got the rest of the day left. You've got a few breakouts, and don't forget that think tank later today, and we'll see you back in here at, I think, 2:25 for Mr. John Tenaglia. Thank you.